My name is Hannah. I am in my early 30s now, but the story I'm about to tell you began when I was still learning how quietly power can move when it isn't announced. If you met me back then, you might have described me as steady, competent, the kind of person people trust with details, deadlines, and difficult conversations they don't want to have themselves. I was never the loudest voice in the room. I didn't interrupt, I didn't posture. I listened more than I spoke, and when I did speak, it was usually after I'd thought something through from every angle. That calm made people comfortable, too comfortable. Most people assumed I would always be there, absorbing pressure, smoothing tension, fixing problems without asking for credit. They saw reliability and mistook it for softness. They saw restraint and assumed a lack of ambition. And because I didn't rush to correct them, they never questioned those assumptions. This isn't a story about revenge. There are no villains tying themselves in knots or dramatic scenes where someone finally gets what they deserve. It's also not a story about sudden luck or a genius master plan that worked overnight. What happened unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, the way real shifts in power usually do. It's a story about boundaries, specifically what happens when one is crossed, unnoticed at first, and then quietly accepted. About how small dismissals can accumulate until they reshape how others treat you and how you see yourself. And about the moment you realize that staying silent is no longer the same as staying ethical. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through a period of my life where I learned the difference between patience and permission, where I discovered that dominance doesn't always announce itself with force. Sometimes it arrives through preparation, documentation, and timing, through choosing not to react, but to reposition. I'll tell you who I was to the people around me, how that role was assigned without my consent, and the exact moment I understood that I had leverage they never saw. I'll tell you about a decision that couldn't be undone once it was made, and why I made it without anger, without celebration, and without asking for approval. By the end of this story, I wasn't triumphant. I was clear. And clarity, I've learned, is far more powerful than rage. I'm sharing this not to be admired, and certainly not to be imitated blindly. I'm sharing it because many of us, especially those who lead quietly, reach a moment where we have to decide whether our silence is serving our values or erasing them. As you listen, I want you to ask yourself just one gentle question. Have you ever been underestimated in a way that felt harmless until it wasn't? To most people in that building, I was predictable in the best and worst ways. I was the one who arrived a few minutes early and stayed a few minutes late. The one who remembered what clients had said months ago and brought it back into the room when it suddenly mattered. I took notes no one else wanted to take, followed up on loose ends no one else noticed, and translated vague executive ideas into something operational. If someone asked, "Can you handle this?" the answer was almost always yes. And if they didn't ask, I usually handled it anyway. What I wasn't in their eyes was central. I wasn't seen as a risk taker, even though every deal I touched carried risk. I wasn't seen as ambitious, even though I was quietly building more context than anyone else in the room. I wasn't seen as someone who would push back because I rarely did, at least not publicly. That perception did not come from malice. It came from habit. In meetings, I was often introduced last, if at all. When decisions were summarized, my contributions were folded into the team's work. If something went wrong, I was trusted to fix it quietly. If something went right, the room moved on quickly, already focused on the next win. I didn't correct the record, not because I didn't notice, but because at the time I believed something else mattered more. I believed consistency would eventually be undeniable. I told myself that people like me didn't need to perform visibility. Those outcomes spoke louder than voices. That staying composed, fair, and useful would naturally lead to authority. It was a comforting belief, especially for someone who disliked self-promotion and conflict. And for a while, it even seemed true. My responsibilities grew steadily. My inbox is filled with more sensitive threads. I was looped into conversations earlier than before, trusted with information others weren't. Externally, it looked like progress. Internally, I felt like a well-kept secret, valuable, but contained. What I didn't see yet was the role forming around me. I was becoming the constant, the stabilizer, the person whose presence allowed others to be bolder, louder, and occasionally careless. My restraint created space, and others filled it. When junior colleagues asked for advice, they came to me. When senior leaders needed something smoothed over, they sent it my way. I became the bridge between intention and execution, between promise and reality. And bridges, I learned, are rarely thanked. They are crossed. There were moments, small, almost forgettable ones, where something inside me paused. A comment that landed slightly wrong. A decision was made without my input that relied entirely on my work. A credit misattributed, not maliciously, but casually. Each time I told myself it wasn't worth addressing. That makes an issue of it would seem petty, emotional, disproportionate. I prided myself on being reasonable, but reason when practiced alone can become a kind of isolation. I watched others with half my context speak with full confidence and be rewarded for it. I watched urgency and volume outperform accuracy. And still, I stayed where I was, useful, calm, quietly essential. If you had asked me then whether I felt invisible, I would have said no. Invisible implies being unseen. I was very much seen, just not in the way that grants agency. I was seen as dependable infrastructure, not as a decision maker. And here's the truth I didn't admit until much later. A part of me helped reinforce that role. Every time I absorbed instead of naming, every time I smoothed instead of stopping, every time I told myself, this isn't the hill to die on. At the time, it felt like maturity. In hindsight, it was permission. Not permission for cruelty, but permission for assumption. Permission for others to decide who I was and what I would tolerate without ever asking me directly. That was who I was to them. Not weak, not naive, just quietly available. And availability, when unlimited, reshapes power. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that blends into every other workday when your calendar is made of back-to-back meetings and your lunch is whatever you can eat while reading emails. We were preparing for a pitch call with a potential client. Mid-seven figures, international scope, high expectations. Exactly the kind of deal leadership cared deeply about. I had spent weeks on it, not just on the numbers or the slides, but on understanding the people behind the decision. Their internal politics, their risk tolerance, what they'd said publicly versus what they hinted at privately. I'd built the strategy carefully, layering conservatism where they feared exposure and ambition where they wanted to impress their board. That morning, I sent a concise briefing to the internal team, nothing flashy, just clarity. A few hours later, we were in the conference room. Glass walls, muted light, the faint hum of the city outside. The usual cast of characters, 2 senior directors, 1 VP dialing in, and me, seated slightly to the side with my notebook open. As the meeting started, one of the directors began outlining the approach. It was my approach, nearly word for word. At first, I felt a flicker of surprise, then a quick internal correction. Of course, we're aligned. This is teamwork. I waited for the natural moment where he'd reference the prep work or gesture in my direction. He didn't. He spoke smoothly, confidently, as if the framework had arrived fully formed in his own head. No one interrupted. No one questioned it. The VP nodded along on the screen. I told myself it didn't matter. The idea was what counted. The client outcome was the priority. Then came the moment, the small cut. The VP asked a follow-up question, a subtle one, about risk exposure in year 2. The director paused, just briefly. I could see the hesitation. It was the one area I'd flagged as needing careful phrasing. Before I could speak, he answered anyway. Not incorrectly, but imprecisely. Just enough to shift the tone. The VP frowned slightly. That's more aggressive than we discussed, he said. The director glanced at his notes. Then casually he said, right, that was something Hannah mentioned earlier. Not design, not recommended, mentioned. The room moved on. The conversation recovered. No one lingered on it, but something in me went still. It wasn't anger, it wasn't humiliation. It was a quiet recalibration. In the span of 30 seconds, my work had been claimed, diluted, and then distanced, without anyone intending harm. The story of the idea had been rewritten in real time, and I'd been reduced to a footnote. I didn't speak up, not because I was afraid, but because the moment had already passed. Correcting it would have required a kind of interruption that would feel jarring, out of proportion, and I'd trained myself to avoid that. After the meeting, a colleague leaned over and said, "Great prep, by the way, that framework really landed." I smiled, I thanked him, I meant it. But later, alone at my desk, I replayed the sequence, not obsessively, just carefully, like rewinding footage to understand how something subtle had happened. I realized no one had done anything wrong by their own standards. The director hadn't set out to minimize me. The VP hadn't questioned ownership. The system simply flowed in the direction it always did, toward the most visible voice. And I had made myself peripheral to that flow. That was the cut, not the loss of credit, but the realization that my presence could be edited out of the narrative without friction, that my contributions were transferable in a way that my authority was not. Still, I said nothing. I documented the moment quietly in my notebook, not as a grievance, but as data. Time, context, exact phrasing. I told myself it was an anomaly, a one-off, not worth adjusting my behavior over. But the body notices what the mind excuses. And once you felt that kind of cut, small, precise, and bloodless, you begin to recognize its shape everywhere. After that meeting, nothing changed on the surface. I was still invited to the same rooms, still asked for input, still trusted with sensitive details. If anything, my workload increased. People leaned on me more, not less. That should have felt validating. Instead, it felt familiar. The next instance came a week later, then another the week after that. Always minor, always defensible. The kind of moments that, taken individually, could be brushed aside with logic. A slide I built appears in a deck with someone else's name on the footer. A client referencing the strategy your team shared, while looking at someone else entirely. A meeting summary was sent out without my name, even though half the decisions trace back to my analysis. Each time I told myself the same story. This is how collaborative environments work. Credit is collective. Ego doesn't matter. And I believed it mostly. What I didn't acknowledge was how consistently that collectiveness seemed to thin out around me. How often my work became communal the moment it left my hands, while other people's ideas stayed firmly attached to their names. I began to anticipate it, to emotionally pre-adjust. When I sent something out, I no longer expected recognition. When someone spoke using my words, I didn't even flinch. That was the most dangerous shift. Not the behavior around me, but the internal normalization. I learned to minimize the moments before they could land, to tell myself that pointing them out would make me look insecure. That staying quiet was a sign of professionalism, not erasure. There's a particular kind of discipline required to tolerate being undervalued without appearing resentful. It involves constantly editing your own reactions, smoothing over micro disappointments before they reach the surface. I became very good at that. In group settings, I spoke less, not because I had less to say, but because I'd noticed that when I spoke last, my contributions were more likely to be treated as clarifications rather than leadership. I framed insights as questions. I softened language that didn't need softening. People responded well to it. They found me easy, grounded, non-threatening. That word, non-threatening, was always offered as praise. Meanwhile, I kept telling myself that I was playing a long game. That substance would eventually outweigh perception. That patience would be rewarded. But patience without boundaries has a way of turning into a silent agreement. The third cut was the one I remember most clearly. It happened during a quarterly review. Senior leadership was present, metrics were shared, wins highlighted. One particular partnership, a difficult one I had negotiated personally, was mentioned as a success story. The VP leading the review spoke about it confidently. He described the challenges, the strategic pivots, and the concessions that had made the deal viable. I watched him describe decisions I'd labored over for months. At the end, someone asked, "Who led that negotiation?" There was a brief pause. Not long enough to be awkward, just long enough to choose a version of the truth. The VP smiled and said, "It was a team effort." And that was it. No correction, no clarification, no follow-up. The room accepted it immediately, because team effort is a complete sentence when power already knows where to land. I didn't feel angry. I felt tired. Not physically, ethically. I realized I was expending energy, maintaining a version of myself that made others comfortable at the cost of my own clarity. I was absorbing ambiguity so others wouldn't have to confront it. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself that speaking up would make things messy, that it would introduce tension where there didn't need to be any, that it might even jeopardize opportunities down the line. What I didn't realize was that my silence was already shaping those opportunities, just not in my favor. By normalizing the dismissals, I was teaching people how to treat me. Not through what I said, but through what I allowed to pass without comment. And once a pattern sets in, it doesn't require intent to continue. It becomes the default. Looking back, I don't blame anyone for what happened next. They were responding to the role I had quietly accepted. At the time, though, I still believed I could outwork the pattern, outlast it, prove through consistency alone that I belong somewhere more central. I didn't yet understand that respect isn't something you earn passively. It's something you make costly to ignore, and I hadn't raised the cost at all. Roles aren't always given with a title. Sometimes they emerge quietly, through repetition, until everyone agrees, without ever saying it out loud, who you are supposed to be. By the time I noticed mine, it was already well established. I was the reliable one, the stabilizer, the person you looped in when something needed to be handled carefully, discreetly, without escalation. I was brought in to support decisions, not to make them, to execute, not to define direction. When pressure rose, people looked to me to absorb it. When ambiguity appeared, I was expected to clarify it. And when authority was needed, it passed over me, as if by instinct, and landed on someone else. No one said this explicitly. There were no conversations where someone told me to stay in my lane. The lane had simply formed around me, shaped by habit and my own compliance. I started to see it in how conversations shifted when I spoke. If I offered a strong opinion early, it was often reframed by someone else before being accepted. If I waited and spoke later, it was treated as a helpful refinement rather than a directive. Either way, my influence remained indirect. People came to me privately for counsel. They trusted my judgment enough to seek it out, but not enough to publicly defer to it. That distinction mattered more than I realized at the time. I became the person others used to sound smart. They would test ideas with me one-on-one, refine their thinking in those quiet spaces, and then present the polished version in larger forums. And because I valued harmony and didn't need credit to feel useful, I let it happen. I told myself that being indispensable was a form of power. But indispensability without authority is a trap. You become too useful to replace and too accommodating to promote. The clearest sign of the role came during a restructuring conversation. A senior leader pulled me aside and said, with genuine warmth, "You're such a steady presence. We really need you exactly where you are." Exactly where I was. Not growing, not leading, not stretching. Holding things together. It was meant as praise. I thanked him. I meant it. Later that night, I wrote the phrase down in my notebook and stared at it longer than I expected to. Exactly where you are. It sounded final in a way that unsettled me. I began to notice how often my flexibility was assumed rather than requested. Deadlines shifted, scope expanded, responsibilities accumulated, all under the assumption that I would adjust quietly. And I did. Not because I lacked boundaries, but because I believed in the work. I believed in doing things well, even when no one was watching. I believed that professionalism meant carrying weight without complaint. What I hadn't accounted for was how easily professionalism can be confused with consent. No one asked me if I wanted to be the anchor. I simply became it. The emotional cost was subtle. I didn't feel wronged. I felt compressed, like a version of myself was being slowly edited down to the most convenient traits: calm, capable, compliant. Ambition, when it surfaced, felt out of place, as if wanting more would disrupt the equilibrium I'd helped create. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. People weren't underestimating me anymore. They were relying on me staying the same. And that reliance came with expectations I hadn't agreed to. I wasn't angry about it. I wasn't even surprised. I was alert. Because once you see the role clearly, you can no longer pretend you're just passing through it. You have to decide whether you'll continue to inhabit it or whether you'll step outside it, knowing it may unsettle people who benefited from your silence. At the time, I still believed I could adjust the role from within, that I could slowly expand it, nudge perceptions, reshape expectations without disruption. I didn't yet understand that roles like mine don't evolve gently. They end. Or you do. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no raised voice, no dramatic realization in a boardroom, no moment where someone crossed a line so clearly that it demanded immediate response. It happened on a quiet afternoon, alone, with a document open on my screen. I was reviewing a draft contract for a potential partnership, large, complex, and unusually aggressive in its terms. It wasn't assigned to me formally. It had simply appeared in my inbox with a note that said, "Can you sanity check this?" That phrasing alone should have signaled something. As I read through those clauses, my stomach tightened. not with fear, but with recognition. The risk allocation was skewed. The liability language is vague. The escalation paths are deliberately ambiguous. It was the kind of contract that looks fine if you skim it and catastrophic if you live with it. I flagged my concerns in the margins, carefully, precisely. I suggested revisions, alternative structures, and contingencies. An hour later, the response came back. Thanks, let's not overthink this. We need to move fast. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. It wasn't the dismissal itself that landed. I was used to that. It was the assumption behind it, that speed mattered more than judgment, and that my role was to validate momentum, not question it. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible, I felt implicated. If this went wrong, my fingerprints would be everywhere. Not publicly, but internally, in the quiet archive of emails and tracked changes. And if it went right, I already knew how the story would be told. I closed the document and leaned back in my chair. Something in me settled, not into anger, but into resolve. I realized that up until that moment, I had been optimizing for harmony, for being useful without friction, for contributing without disturbing the narrative others preferred. But this wasn't about recognition anymore. It was about alignment. I asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. If I stay quiet here, am I still acting with integrity or just protecting my comfort? The answer was immediate and uncomfortable. That was the day I stopped telling myself that silence was neutral. I began to review everything differently. Not emotionally, but structurally. I noticed how often I was included after decisions were already leaning one way. How my objections were welcomed only if they didn't slow things down. How my expertise was trusted selectively. It wasn't personal, it was systemic. And systems don't respond to feelings, they respond to leverage. That afternoon, I didn't send a follow-up. I didn't escalate. I didn't warn anyone dramatically. I simply documented, methodically, unemotionally. I saved versions. I archived emails. I noted timelines, not as a threat. The record. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that my value wasn't just in what I produced, but in what I could prove. That shift was quiet, but it was complete. I stopped volunteering fixes for problems I hadn't been invited to solve. I answered questions directly without cushioning. I stopped reframing my insights as suggestions when they were, in fact, conclusions. People didn't notice immediately. Why would they? The change was internal first. But I noticed how differently I felt, lighter. Not because things were easier, but because I was no longer negotiating with myself about what I owed others at the expense of my own standards. That was the day I understood something fundamental. Restraint is powerful only when it's chosen. Until then, mine had been reflexive. From that point on, silence became intentional, and intention changes everything. Once silence became a choice, it stopped feeling like absence. It became present, just a different kind. I didn't announce any change. I didn't set new rules or draw visible lines in meetings. I simply began to act as though my time, my attention, and my agreement had weight. The first thing I stopped doing was preemptive labor. I no longer anticipated problems before they were formally acknowledged. If someone asked, I responded fully. If they didn't, I let the gap exist. At first, that gap made people uneasy. They were used to me filling it. I watched carefully. Meetings stretched longer. Small errors surfaced that I would have previously corrected quietly. Questions circled without resolution. Nothing catastrophic, just enough friction to reveal how much invisible work I'd been doing. No one connected it to me. Why would they? I hadn't withdrawn. I was still present, still engaged, still calm, just selective. When I did speak, I was precise. I didn't soften statements that were meant to land clearly. I didn't add disclaimers or jokes to make others comfortable. I stated observations as observations, not as invitations for debate. Something interesting happened. People began to listen more closely, not because I raised my voice, but because I spoke less often, and only when it mattered. My silence between contributions gave weight to the moments I chose to engage. Still, the assumption remained that my restraint was a form of compliance. In one meeting, a senior leader said, "I appreciate that you're flexible on this," after I declined to weigh in on a decision that had already been made. I nodded. I didn't correct him. Flexibility is how compliance is described when it's convenient. Privately, I began to prepare. Not emotionally, strategically. I reviewed old projects, contracts, and partnerships. I traced patterns. I noted who relied on my work and where the dependencies weren't documented properly. I identified moments where my judgment had been sought but not credited, where my caution had prevented risk that was never acknowledged. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was building a map. And maps, unlike arguments, don't require permission. The silence gave me space. Without the constant drain of smoothing, explaining, and compensating, I had bandwidth. I used it. People continued to underestimate the shift. They mistook my calm for passivity, my lack of reaction to the agreement, my professionalism for predictability. That misinterpretation became an asset, because while they assumed continuity, I was repositioning. I began asking questions that seemed innocuous but carried weight, about decision authority, about sign-off processes, about accountability when things went wrong. I framed them as clarification, not a challenge. No one objected. Why would they? It all sounded reasonable. Each answer gave me more information. I learned where power actually sat, as opposed to where titles suggested it did. I learned which approvals were symbolic and which were binding. I learned how risk was transferred quietly, and who absorbed it when deals soured. And I learned how often that absorption fell to people like me. The irony was not lost on me. My silence, once seen as a weakness, now allowed me to see everything clearly. Without the noise of needing to be liked or validated, patterns emerged. I felt no urgency to act. This wasn't about exposure or confrontation. It was about readiness. When you stop explaining yourself, you gain time. When you stop correcting others, you gain data. And when you stop reacting, you gain leverage, because you're no longer predictable. By the time anyone sensed that something had shifted, it was already too late to frame it as a misunderstanding. They still thought I was quiet. They just didn't realize that quiet had become deliberate. What they never noticed was how much information passes through someone who is underestimated. When people don't see you as a threat, they stop guarding their language. They speak more freely. They forward things without editing. They assume you're aligned simply because you're calm. I let them assume. While meetings continued and projects moved forward, I started paying attention to what lived between the official narratives, the gaps, the inconsistencies, the moments where decisions were described differently depending on who was in the room. I wasn't eavesdropping, I wasn't spying, I was doing what I'd always done, listening carefully. The difference was that now I was listening for structure, not harmony. I noticed how often verbal agreements replaced written ones, when urgency was used as justification. How certain concessions were framed as temporary but never revisited. How responsibility blurred when outcomes were uncertain, but sharpened quickly when credit was available. I began organizing everything, not obsessively, systematically. I created timelines that showed how decisions evolved. I linked emails to meeting notes. I highlighted where risks had been flagged, and by whom, and what responses they received. I tracked patterns of escalation and avoidance. None of it was dramatic. In fact, it was boring in the way that real leverage often is. What surprised me most was how much of this information already existed. It just hadn't been connected. Everyone assumed someone else was keeping track. No one expected me to be, because I was still playing the role outwardly. I attended meetings. I nodded when appropriate. I asked clarifying questions. I didn't rush. I didn't challenge authority directly. I stayed composed. Inside, though, my understanding of the organization deepened in a way that titles alone could never provide. I learned which deals were politically sensitive, not because of their size, but because of who had sponsored them. I learned which leaders avoided documentation and which relied on it. I learned where accountability quietly stopped. And I learned something else, something personal. I realized that my earlier silence hadn't been wasted. It had trained me. Years of observing without reacting had sharpened my perception. I could recall conversations with uncanny precision. I remembered tone, timing, and context. I knew when something felt off because I'd been cataloging off for a long time. That ability became my edge. While others focused on performance and visibility, I focused on continuity, on what stayed true across changing narratives. The preparation wasn't fueled by resentment, it was fueled by clarity. I wasn't trying to expose anyone. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was preparing for a moment I couldn't yet see, but knew would come. Because systems built on assumptions eventually strain under reality, and when they do, the person who understands the system, not the loudest voice, defines what happens next. There were nights I stayed late, not because I had to, but because I wanted to finish mapping a sequence while it was still fresh. There were weekends when I reread contracts with new eyes, noticing clauses I'd once glossed over because they weren't my decision. They were my responsibility, though, in practice, if not on paper. And responsibility, when unacknowledged, creates power when documented. Still, no one noticed. They saw the same Hannah, calm, reliable, quietly effective. They didn't see the preparation because preparation doesn't announce itself. It looks like patience. It looks like a restraint. It looks like someone who isn't in a hurry. What they couldn't imagine was that I was no longer waiting for permission. I was waiting for alignment between my values, the facts, and the moment when action would be clean, not reactive. By the time that moment arrived, everything I needed was already in place. They just didn't know it yet. The reveal didn't arrive like a revelation. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of triumph. It came quietly through confirmation. I was reviewing a set of documents late one evening. Versions of the same contract circulated over several months. At first glance, they looked identical. Minor edits, cosmetic changes, the kind that signals progress without altering substance. But when I aligned them side by side, a pattern emerged. Certain clauses had been softened verbally, but never amended in writing. Certain responsibilities had been discussed as shared, yet consistently landed on one party, ours, when it came to liability. And most telling of all, the decision to proceed had been justified repeatedly by referencing my earlier risk assessments that had been selectively paraphrased. I wasn't misquoted. I was curated. My cautions were used to demonstrate diligence, while my conditions for approval were quietly omitted. The narrative had become, Hannah reviewed it, therefore it sounds. That's when I understood the leverage. Not emotional, not personal, but factual. I could trace exactly how my expertise had been used as insulation, how my reputation for careful judgment had allowed others to move faster, bolder, and with less accountability. And crucially, I could prove it. Emails, attachments, track changes, meeting notes, calendar invites. The sequence was clean, chronological, and indisputable. I sat back and let that understanding settle. This wasn't about catching anyone in a lie. It was about the clarity of ownership, about who would carry the consequences if things went wrong, and who would claim credit if they went right. For the first time, I saw my position without distortion. I wasn't peripheral. I was central, just not visibly so. The organization's confidence rested, in part, on the assumption that I would continue to absorb risk quietly, that I would stand behind decisions I hadn't fully endorsed, because I always had. That assumption was the leverage. I felt no urge to expose it immediately, no desire to confront anyone or demand recognition. In fact, the absence of urgency was what told me I was ready. When you're acting from emotion, you want resolution. When you're acting from clarity, you can wait. I asked myself a difficult question that night. What outcome would be fair? Not flattering, not vindictive, but aligned with my values. The answer wasn't punishment, it was an agency. I wanted my judgment to be treated as binding, not decorative. I wanted responsibility to be matched with authority. And I wanted to stop being used as a quiet endorsement for decisions I didn't control. That meant crossing a line, not ethically but relationally. The line between contributor and decision maker, between silent expert and visible authority. Crossing it would change how people saw me. It would likely unsettle dynamics that had benefited from my restraint. It might even cost me goodwill. I accepted that. Because once you see the truth of your position, pretending otherwise becomes a kind of self-betrayal. I didn't act immediately. I refined the documentation. I ensured timelines were precise. I removed any language that could be interpreted as emotional or speculative. I reduced everything to facts. Then I waited, not for a crisis, for an opportunity where clarity would be necessary and silence would no longer be sufficient. That opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. But when it did, I was ready, not to react, but to step forward cleanly, without drama, without accusation, just with the truth, presented calmly. At the moment, it could no longer be ignored. The decision didn't come with pressure from outside, no ultimatum, no threat, no dramatic failure forcing my hand. It came with options. That I've learned is how real turning points usually arrive. Not as emergencies, but as choices that look reasonable no matter which way you turn. Choices that ask you who you're willing to become next. The opportunity appeared as an email marked urgent, though nothing about it was sudden. A partner we'd been courting for months had accelerated their timeline. They wanted to move forward with a high-value deal, larger than anything our team had closed that year. The terms were aggressive. The upside was enormous. The exposure, equally so. And they wanted an answer quickly. Leadership moved fast. Meetings were scheduled, talking points drafted. Everyone focused on momentum, on not losing the window. I was looped in late as usual. "Can you review this one last time?" someone asked. "We need your comfort level before we sign." Comfort level. No approval, not authority. Just reassurance. I opened the draft and felt the weight of the moment immediately. Not emotionally, but structurally. This deal intersected with everything I'd been tracking. The same patterns, the same assumptions, the same quiet transfer of risk. If I stayed in my role, the outcome was predictable. I would flag concerns. Some would be acknowledged, others deferred. My name would be used to signal diligence. The deal would be signed. And if complications emerged later, my earlier cautions would be referenced selectively, proof that due process had occurred. No one would be acting in bad faith. But I would be complicit in a structure that asked me to carry responsibility without authority. The alternative was simple and irreversible. I could refuse to endorse the deal without formal decision-making power. Not as a protest, not as a threat, but as a boundary. I could say, calmly and clearly, that I would not lend my judgment to an agreement I did not control. That choice wouldn't stop the deal. It would force a decision about me. I sat with it longer than I expected to, not because I was afraid of consequences, but because I wanted to be certain of my motive. This wasn't about recognition or leverage for its own sake. It was about alignment. If I crossed this line, there would be no going back to the role I'd occupied so comfortably for so long. People would reassess me, some would feel challenged, others inconvenienced. But staying would mean accepting that this was my ceiling, being consulted, not empowered. That realization settled things quietly. In the meeting that followed, I spoke carefully. I didn't accuse anyone of misuse or minimization. I didn't reference past patterns. I didn't raise my voice or dramatize risk. I simply said this: I'm not comfortable serving as a validating step on this decision without being formally accountable for it. If my assessment is going to be used to justify the agreement, then I need the authority to shape its final terms. Otherwise, I need to step back from endorsing it. The room went still, not hostile, not shock. Just recalibrating. No one argued immediately. No one dismissed me. They asked clarifying questions about scope, about responsibility, about what exactly I was asking for. I answered plainly. I wasn't negotiating a title. I was defining a condition. Either my judgment mattered enough to be binding, or it mattered only as commentary. I was willing to accept either outcome. What I wasn't willing to do was blur the line anymore. That was the moment of no return. Because even if nothing changed externally, something had already shifted internally. I had named the boundary. I had chosen coherence over comfort. The contract would eventually be signed. My reputation would be sealed, but not in the way anyone expected. After that meeting, there was no announcement, no decision memo, no follow-up declaring a change in structure or authority. If anything, things looked exactly the same from the outside. Calendars filled, Slack messages continued. People spoke about timelines and deliverables as if nothing significant had happened. That was the point. Moments that truly alter power dynamics rarely come with noise. They come with delays, with side conversations, with people recalculating privately before they respond publicly. I didn't push for a resolution. I didn't chase clarity. I let the silence do its work. In the days that followed, I was noticeably excluded from a few conversations. Not dramatically, just small shifts. A meeting was removed from my calendar, a document shared without my email address included. The kind of things that usually happen when people aren't sure where you stand anymore. I took note, and I kept working. But my work changed shape. I stopped commenting on drafts unless my input was explicitly requested. When it was, I responded in writing, clearly, and without hedging. I removed informal language. No, just a thought. No, feel free to ignore. Only statements that could stand on their own. At the same time, I began preparing for either outcome. If leadership chose to proceed without me, I would be protected. My documentation was complete. My boundaries were on record. My role would narrow, but it would be clean. If they chose to bring me in fully, I would be ready. Not aspirationally, operationally. I reviewed governance structures, I outlined decision frameworks. I mapped what accountability would actually require in practice, not in title alone. Still, no one said anything directly. That ambiguity unsettled some people more than open conflict would have. I could see it in the way questions were phrased around me, carefully, politely, as if testing whether I would revert. I didn't. Weeks passed. The deal progressed. Negotiations tightened. Pressure increased. Then one afternoon, I received a calendar invite from the VP. Just the two of us. No agenda. The conversation was brief. He didn't apologize. He didn't defend past behavior. He acknowledged, plainly, that the way decisions had been structured placed undue risk on people without matching authority. He said, "If we move forward, we need you in a formal decision-making role on this partnership." I listened. I asked questions. I clarified the scope. I didn't celebrate, because celebration implies surprise. This wasn't surprising. It was the logical outcome of facts meeting boundaries. From that point on, things moved quickly, but quietly. Legal was looped in differently. Approval chains were adjusted. Language shifted from input to sign-off. My name appeared where it hadn't before, not as acknowledgement, but as responsibility. No announcement went out to the broader team. No one clapped. No one congratulated me. Some people noticed anyway. Their tone changed, not warmer, more precise. They stopped assuming my agreement. They asked. Others avoided eye contact for a while, not out of anger, out of uncertainty. The version of me they'd known no longer fit neatly. I didn't explain myself to them. I didn't need to. When the final version of the contract circulated, I read it slowly, carefully, clause by clause. This time my conditions weren't footnotes. They were embedded. I signed, not because I'd won, but because, for the first time, my responsibility and authority were aligned. The rest would follow. The consequences didn't arrive like fallout. They arrived in confusion. At first, it was subtle. A few people noticed that decisions were taking longer, not because of bureaucracy, but because questions were being answered differently, more precisely, with less room for interpretation. Where there had once been flexibility, there was now clarity. Where there had once been assumptions, there were now conditions. I hadn't changed my tone. I hadn't become rigid or defensive. I was still calm, still collaborative, but I no longer absorbed ambiguity on behalf of others. That absence was felt almost immediately. A director asked me, half jokingly, "When did legal suddenly become so intense?" I smiled and said, "It's not legal, it's alignment." He laughed, unsure whether I was serious. He found out soon enough. Meetings began to feel different, not tense, accountable. People came prepared. They read documents before discussing them. They asked questions earlier, not at the last minute. They stopped saying, "We'll figure it out later," because later now had a name attached to it. Mine. What surprised me was not the resistance, but the discomfort. Some people struggled with the loss of elasticity. They had grown used to a system where momentum mattered more than precision, where judgment could be borrowed without being shared. Now judgment came with ownership. A few weeks into the partnership, a complication surfaced. Not a failure, just an unexpected regulatory issue in one of the international markets. In the past, this would have triggered a scramble. Emails flying, meetings stacking. People are searching for someone to quietly resolve it. This time the response was measured. I convened the right people. I referenced the clauses we'd built for exactly this scenario. I outlined options, consequences, and timelines. No drama, no urgency theater, just process. Later, someone said to me, "This feels different, more contained." Contained, that word again. The difference was that this time, I was doing the containing by design, not absorbing chaos, but structuring response. Not everyone appreciated it. I noticed certain voices growing quieter. People who once dominated discussions now deferred. Others, who had relied on me as a sounding board, stopped dropping by unannounced. They didn't say why. They didn't need to. The system no longer bent around them the way it used to. I wasn't excluded. I was central. And centrality, I learned, creates distance. One afternoon, I overheard someone say, "We should run this by Hannah before committing." Not because they wanted reassurance, but because they needed approval. That was new. And with it came a subtle shift in how loss was experienced. People began to feel friction they couldn't name. Deals took more thought. Risks were surfaced earlier. Shortcuts closed. No one blamed me openly. There was nothing to blame. But the ease they'd once enjoyed, the ease my silence had provided, was gone. That loss registered as irritation, as nostalgia for how things used to move. as quiet resistance to a structure that asked more of them than they were accustomed to giving. I didn't internalize it because I understood what was happening. When you stop compensating for a system's weaknesses, the system feels heavier to those who benefited from your compensation. That weight isn't punishment, it's reality. And reality, once reintroduced, is hard to argue with. The most telling consequence wasn't conflict, it was restraint. People chose their words more carefully around me. They looped me in earlier. They stopped assuming alignment and started seeking it, not out of fear, out of respect. And respect, I found, doesn't always feel warm. Sometimes it feels like distance. By the time people realized something had fundamentally changed, they framed it as a phase, a shift in tone, a temporary tightening, a reaction to a high-stakes deal that would eventually relax once things stabilized. That assumption became their last mistake. Because what they were feeling wasn't tension, it was permanence. The first real signs of panic didn't come from leadership. They came from the middle layer, the ones who had relied most heavily on my flexibility, and who now found themselves exposed. A manager stopped by my desk one afternoon, speaking more quickly than usual. He wanted to sense-check an email before sending it, something he used to do often. I read it once, then I handed it back. "I think you should be clear about who owns that decision," I said. "Right now, it sounds like you're asking for cover." He blinked, smiled awkwardly. "Yeah, I guess I was." I nodded. No judgment, just accuracy. He left without sending the email. After that, the request changed. People stopped asking me to soften messages. They stopped asking me to reframe things diplomatically. They started asking whether something would hold up, legally, contractually, reputationally. Those are harder questions. They don't have emotional answers. The discomfort deepened when a second deal stalled. Not failed, stalled. Legal flagged inconsistencies early. Finance pushed back on assumptions that used to slide through. No one was rushing to override concerns because they knew they would have to own the consequences. The phrase, "we'll figure it out later," disappeared from meetings. Later had arrived. I watched people try to restore the old dynamic in small ways, inviting me into conversations casually, as if proximity alone might bring back the cushioning I used to provide. Using familiar language, referencing shared history. I didn't reject them, I simply didn't revert. I stayed precise, I stayed boundaried. And slowly, it dawned on them. This wasn't something they could fix with rapport. One director finally said it out loud during a meeting, half joking, half strained. "Wow, things are a lot more serious now." No one laughed. The truth was, things weren't more serious. They were just more honest. And honesty, when you're used to ambiguity working in your favor, feels like constraint. A few people tried a different approach. They began advocating for me in a way that came too late. They mentioned my name more often in meetings. They acknowledged my role in past successes. They spoke about how integral I had always been. I noticed. I appreciated the intent, but I also recognized the timing. Recognition offered after authority is established isn't restoration. It's adaptation. They weren't trying to give me something I lacked. They were trying to recalibrate their relationship to the new structure. I didn't hold it against them, but I didn't let it change anything. Because once you stop accepting misalignment, you can't unsee it. You can't pretend that warmth makes up for clarity, or that praise substitutes for power. The most revealing moment came when someone asked me quietly, "Is there any way we can go back to how it was? Just less intense?" I looked at him for a long second before answering. "I don't think how it was as healthy as it felt," I said. "It just wasn't obvious who was paying the cost." That ended the conversation. Not because he disagreed, but because he understood. It was too late to fix anything by undoing it. The system had already adjusted. Roles had shifted. Expectations had reset. And I wasn't interested in being fixed back into a shape that served everyone else better than it served the truth. There was no anger in that, no satisfaction, just finality. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal, no emotional reckoning in a glass-walled room. It happened the way most honest things do, plainly, and a little late. It was a scheduled meeting, 30 minutes, a small room. 3 people, myself, the VP, and one senior director who had worked closely with me for years. No one looked defensive, no one looked relaxed. We all knew why we were there. The director spoke first. "I want to understand where we lost you," he said. Not accusing, genuinely puzzled. I didn't correct the framing, I let it stand. "I didn't go anywhere," I said. "I just stopped compensating." That landed quietly. He frowned, not in disagreement, but in recognition. We didn't realize you felt like you were compensating. I know, I said. That's part of the issue. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, thoughtful. The VP asked, "Was there a specific moment that triggered this?" I considered the question carefully. I could have pointed to the first cut, or the normalization, or the way my judgment had been used selectively. Instead, I said the truth that mattered most. There was a point where my name was being used to justify decisions I didn't control, I said. At that point, staying quiet stopped being neutral. No one interrupted. No one defended. The director nodded slowly. "We trusted you." "I know," I said. "But trust without authority still carries risk. Just not for everyone." That was the closest thing to an accusation I offered. And it didn't feel like one. What surprised me was how little I wanted anything from them in that moment. No apology, no reassurance, no acknowledgement of past mistakes. I wasn't there to rewrite history. I was there to define the present. The VP leaned back and said, "You could have said something sooner." I met his eyes. I could have, but I also didn't know yet what I was willing to change. That was true. There's a difference between knowing something is wrong and knowing what you're prepared to lose to make it right. I hadn't known that before. The director exhaled. "So where does that leave us?" I answered without hesitation. "It leaves us with clarity," I said. "My role is no longer informal. My responsibility is explicit, and I won't step outside of that again. No threat, no ultimatum. Just a statement." They accepted it more easily than I expected. Not because they were generous, but because the system had already adapted. The deals were moving differently. The outcomes were stabilizing. The value was evident. Power rarely argues when it's working. Before the meeting ended, the director said something quietly. "I didn't realize how much you were holding." I nodded. "Neither did I, at first." That was the end of it. No handshake, no resolution speech, just a shared understanding that something had closed and something else had taken its place. When I walked out of the room, I didn't feel relief. I felt grounded. Because confrontation without heat isn't about winning. It's about ending the need to explain yourself ever again. Who I am now isn't defined by what I endured, or even by what I changed. It's defined by what I no longer negotiate. I didn't become louder. I didn't harden. I didn't reinvent myself into someone unrecognizable. From the outside, I probably look very similar to the woman I was before. Composed, thoughtful, deliberate. But internally, the center of gravity has shifted. I no longer confuse restraint with virtue. I no longer equate harmony with integrity. And I no longer offer my judgment without ensuring it carries the weight it deserves. The biggest difference is this. I am no longer available for ambiguity that benefits everyone but me. That doesn't make me colder. It makes it clearer. People interact with me differently now. Some with more caution, some with more respect. A few with a distance that never existed before. I let that distance exist. Not everyone is meant to come with you when you change your posture. Some relationships are built entirely on who you were willing to be for others, not on who you actually are. I don't resent that. I understand it. What surprised me most was how little bitterness I carried forward. I'd expected some residue, some lingering frustration or urge to be seen as right. Instead, there was calm, because clarity doesn't need witnesses. I still mentor younger colleagues. I still listen carefully. I still believe in doing things well, even when no one is watching. But I no longer disappear into the work. When I speak now, it's not to persuade, it's to define. And definitions, unlike arguments, don't invite debate. I've been asked how I change things without burning bridges. The honest answer is, I didn't focus on bridges at all. I focused on alignment. When your values, your actions, and your boundaries align, the right structures form around you naturally. Not comfortably, but sustainably. I didn't demand dominance. I embodied it quietly. The irony is that the authority I hold now feels lighter than the responsibility I carried before. Because it's shared. Because it's named, because it's honest, because I sleep better, I hesitate less, I say no without rehearsing it internally first. And perhaps most importantly, I trust myself more, not because I won, but because I didn't abandon myself to stay agreeable. That trust changes how you move through the world. It changes how long you wait before speaking, and whether you speak at all. It changes what you tolerate in silence, and what you refuse to carry quietly ever again. This isn't a story about becoming powerful. It's a story about becoming congruent. And once that happens, everything else rearranges itself around you. If there's a lesson in all of this, it isn't about ambition or patience or even power. It's about consent, not the kind we talk about openly, but the quiet kind we give every day through what we allow, what we absorb, and what we explain away as just how things are. For a long time, I believed that staying calm, capable, and reasonable was enough, that integrity would be recognized eventually, that if I just kept my head down and did good work, the system would correct itself. But systems don't self-correct. They stabilize around what they're given. And what I gave, without realizing it, was unlimited tolerance. Crossing a line doesn't always look like betrayal or cruelty. Sometimes it looks like being used as validation without being given authority, like being relied on without being recognized, like being trusted privately but not publicly. Those lines are easy to miss because they don't hurt right away. They feel manageable, rational, until one day you realize you've been paying a cost no one else agreed to carry. The moment I crossed my own line, by refusing to lend my judgment without ownership, everything changed. Not because I forced it to, but because I stopped participating in a misalignment that had become convenient for others. The contract was signed. My reputation was sealed, not as the quiet fixer, not as the background stabilizer, but as someone whose presence changes the structure of a decision. There was no revenge in that, no victory speech, no collapse of egos around me, just a recalibration. And the truth is, some people will never forgive you for removing your silence. Not because you were wrong, but because it forced them to face something they didn't want to see. That's not your burden to carry. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about coherence, about choosing not to betray your own standards in the name of comfort or approval. It's about knowing when patience becomes permission and having the courage to withdraw that permission without hostility. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Pay attention to what your silence is teaching people. Pay attention to who benefits from your restraint. And ask yourself, honestly, whether you're choosing quiet or just avoiding discomfort. I'm curious to know, have you ever reached a moment where staying silent felt easier, but speaking would have changed everything? If you're comfortable, share your story in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.